Well, thank you very much. Since my two colleagues speak French fluently, I will start in English, and then I will switch smoothly in French. But let's start first in English. And to tell you, and of course I will not repeat what has been beautifully said, but it is really timely that we present this review. And mainly, because usually when you launch an industrial strategy, and we were reminding Margrethe and myself that it's almost 1 year ago that we presented in this very room the industrial strategy. Of course, it was the beginning of the pandemic, but nobody could have imagined what we went through. Of course, we are not yet out, but at least, I should say, and I'm very prudent and cautious, but for the first time, we start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And we know that this light is called vaccines. And that's why I think it's extremely important that we stop 1 minute, we look what happened versus our strategy. Of course, as Margrethe and Valdis said, we will not change it. Strategy is done to last for decades, hopefully. But it's important because what we went through is so unbelievable. To stay, to sit, to discuss with all our ecosystems, to understand how they have been impacted, the 14 of them, to make the micro-analysis, ecosystem per ecosystem, which is, by the way, in the package, to understand, again, tourism, extremely impacted, automotive industry, aeronautic industry, health industry, and so on. They all have been impacted, but of course at different level, and we need to understand that to take the right decision. And especially, by the way, at the very time where we will very soon will be able to give back Valdis and Margrethe to member states, hopefully what they're expecting from the next generation EU, and which will help, of course, these ecosystems in the digital transition. The second reason why it's extremely important is obviously because we learn things. Unbelievable. We learned that a partner for yesterday could not be a partner for today. We saw this in the vaccines, and I can tell you that when I've been tasked, I take this example, I will not speak too long on this, but when I've been tasked to see what was happening on the industrial landscape with the vaccines, of course, we knew that we had a lot of supply chains all over the world. We are an open continent, and will continue to be an open continent. It's extremely important. And this is why we had global supply chains. But for reasons that we have not been able to anticipate, of course, some of our partners decided to block or to have executive orders to block everything, including our supply chains. And one of my first tasks has been to be able to reopen this discussion with our partners. They had probably good reasons to block it. And thank you, by the way, Valdis, to have put in place the instrument which help us to enter into the new dialogue and, at the end of the day, to have everything to be much more fluid. This means what? This means that in less than a year, adapting ourselves to the quote-unquote new world and new environment, we have been able to continue to supply our resources in vaccines, to become, probably at the end of this year, the first continent in terms of industrial capacity of vaccine production, which was something we could have not imagined, while, of course, decided what were our rules and how to apply it. The second thing, of course, that we all have in mind before starting is that we saw also in this crisis some shortages, unexpected shortages, and especially in semiconductors, due for geopolitical tensions, let's call it this way. And of course, here also, we realized, if I take just semiconductors, it's so critical, by the way, semiconductors, because now it will come everywhere, in every product, in every car. By the way, for the car industry, in the next maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years, connected cars, semiconductors will account for 35% of the price of a vehicle. So, I mean, it is strategic, and we have seen that because we had our supply chain everywhere in the world, and most of them, by the way, in China. 20 years ago, Europe was producing, in Europe, 40% of the global needs in semiconductors. Today, it's 9%. And of course, we moved a lot in China, which I understand. By the way, I was part of it when I was in my previous life. But we have seen that for changes in the geopolitical environment, which will last, by the way, we are now to cope with a strong demand which is not fulfilled. And of course, it has consequences to stop, including some chain of production in the automotive industry. So that's why here also we need to draw the lessons to see how to sit together with our European companies, decide where we want to go, and then, of course, move forward to come back to, if I take the semiconductors, our digital ambition, Margrethe, that we expressed, I think, a few weeks ago, 20% market share worldwide in semiconductors by 2020. And it's a lot of tasks. Donc, si vous voulez maintenant...
So, I shall speak French for a moment now then. You'll see that we have drawn various conclusions, very practical conclusions, focusing on values and principles. We are an open continent, and of course we will remain an open continent. That's a very important thing. However, as was said earlier, we're doing this on our own terms. A few years ago, who would have believed that we would be presenting this package that we're presenting today? We've been welcoming to everyone, but we mustn't be naive because we are in competition with other people. We need to work for everybody's interests, including our companies, particularly in terms of financing. We need to have the resources available. You'll see the amount in the document, but it's also a very important thing that we focus on particular services, and if there is a demand, we need to intervene. And as Commissioner for Single Market, companies and SMEs have just seen that this is necessary every day. And so with Margrethe now we're very happy about the situation. We see what the demands are, and we finally have the tools. No country alone could have done this. The very important thing, as Margrethe said, is that we now have an example of Europe with its rules continuing to be open, continuing to apply its own conditions, and a country on its own couldn't have done that. That's very important. So coming back now to the package which has been presented today, I won't go into all the detail because I think that we've had a very interesting, a very full presentation from Mrs. Vice-President Mr. Dombrovskis. But from a microeconomic point of view, we need to look at this very carefully. There's an awful lot of information in there. Now, we've got 3 DGs. It doesn't usually, I don't usually end up in the position of having to thank everybody, but thank you. Thank you for the extraordinary work you've done. And it's been very useful working together so we can understand this information, Margrethe, as you said, bottom up, and go through it to ecosystem by ecosystem. Now, secondly, I think on the whole issue of dependence, really much has been said about this. Honestly speaking, the agro teams have looked at these hundreds of thousands of products, 5,000 products. That's no mean feat. 134 were identified as areas where we might be a little bit over-dependent. We're open, yes, but we've learned this from the crisis. We've seen that for some of these products, we need to be not necessarily strategic, I wouldn't necessarily call it that, but with these products, we need to keep a careful eye. I mean, for example, bicycle frames. I don't know if it's strategic or not, but you've got diamonds, things like that. You've got all these different types of products where you have to say, these are the areas where we're dependent. And this is important. And we need to identify these. And as I say, we identified 32 where we are really slightly exposed to risk because we are over-dependent on certain countries. Now, I would encourage you to look at this. If you look at the individual countries and the dependence, a lot of China in there, of course, Russia and the US as well. So please do look at that. We're not necessarily trying to bring everything home. We're not saying that. We're all working as professionals. We're not completely naive, of course. But we need to engage in discussion on the individual ecosystems and say, look, this is an area where we're very dependent. This could be a problem. Can we diversify a little bit our supply chains? And possibly for certain rare components, we may need more of a circular economy approach. That's very important, particularly for the SMEs, but not just for them. We need to invest in innovation to replace some of the supplies. Now, just a quick word also on this point. I think that the main end goal of this work is to look ahead. And that's not necessarily very easy. We need to look ahead for each ecosystem. All the major companies, of course, and the smaller ones. And where we are working through a transition, a lot of these will be facing the consequences of the current crisis. They are being helped by member states, of course. But there's also the question of how we can work through investment. At European level, investments is money that's borrowed from the financial market, and our children are the ones who are going to be paying this back. So you've got this double obligation. You need to be efficient, of course, that you've got this moral element. You have to ensure that the money is used in such a way as you can work through a transition efficiently. We have identified our goals now very clearly. We've got to work with tourism, steel, of course, and other areas as well, so that people will have the resources to get through the crisis, and as we look ahead to 2030. And then on our instrument, it is working very well indeed. It's a question of seeing what we have in Europe. It's a very useful tool, a very European tool in the way it's been designed, because it's very inclusive. So these alliances mean that everybody has a voice. Hydrogen batteries, we've seen it in those cases. We're seeing it now with semiconductors. We have seen it over the last few months. In cloud and edge, it's the same. We're bringing everyone together in these alliances, and it's very important because everybody has something to say. We need to listen to them, see what people's strengths are, their weaknesses, see what their strategies are. And of course, at the same time, we're very open, so we welcome anybody else who wants to join us in this process. But we need to know what we're going to do and why we are. With semiconductors, I think one very important and interesting thing is that because we know very well that semiconductors are being manufactured in Europe, but we need to move from 30 to 10 nanometers now. And we're going to need partnerships developed to do that. So through alliances, as Valdis was saying earlier on, for semiconductors and industrial cloud, that is going to be very important, as it will be for the future aeroplane. A no carbon emissions plane. So these alliances, as I say, are going to allow us to work in an inclusive way with European companies and involving other people as well. We shouldn't be naive. We need to make sure we have the resources available to cover